when police searched the pockets of 18-year-old Christa Pike on January 13, 1995, they found something that would become one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in Tennessee criminal history. Wrapped carefully in a cloth, tucked close to her body, was a fragment of human bone. Not just any bone. A piece of skull, taken from a classmate she had murdered less than 24 hours earlier. She kept it as a trophy. She carried it with pride. And when investigators asked her why, her answer revealed a darkness that would make her the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States in over 40 years. This is the story of jealousy, manipulation, and a crime so brutal that it changed the way we think about teenage violence. But it starts long before that January night, in places far from the woods where Colleen Slemmer took her last breath. In the early 1990s, Knoxville, Tennessee, was home to a federal program designed to give struggling teenagers a second chance. The Job Corps Training Center offered vocational education, housing, and supervision for young people who had fallen through the cracks. Some came from broken homes. Others had dropped out of school or run into trouble with the law. The program promised structure, skill development, and hope for a better future. But beneath that promise was a reality that administrators rarely discuss publicly. You had hundreds of emotionally vulnerable teenagers living in close quarters with limited supervision. Dorm life meant constant social friction. Relationships formed fast and burned hot. Staff members were overworked and understaffed. Mental health resources were minimal. Cliques developed. Conflicts simmered. And when jealousy or betrayal entered the mix, there were few systems in place to stop things from escalating. The Knoxville Job Corps campus sat near the University of Tennessee, sprawling across several buildings that had once served different purposes. Students moved between training sessions and dormitories in a routine that felt normal on the surface. They learned different skills. The days were structured around classes and job training. The evenings were supposed to be supervised recreation time. But those who lived there knew the truth. Tensions ran high. Personal disputes could explode overnight. The dorms became echo chambers for rumors and gossip. Young people who had never learned healthy conflict resolution were now navigating romantic relationships, social hierarchies, and territorial disputes with almost no adult guidance. Security staff focused on preventing students from leaving campus, not on monitoring their interactions with each other. In early 1995, one dispute would end in murder, and those woods would become a crime scene. To understand how we got there, you have to understand the girl who would become Tennessee's most infamous teenage killer. Christa Gale Pike was born on March 10, 1976, in West Virginia. Her childhood was marked by instability from the start. Her mother struggled with addiction. There were periods when Christa barely saw her, left instead with relatives or temporary caregivers who were ill-equipped to raise a child with her needs. She craved affection and attention, but received neither in any consistent form. Her earliest memories were of moving from place to place, different apartments, different towns, different adults who made temporary promises. She learned early that people leave, that love was conditional, that she could never truly rely on anyone. These lessons shaped her in ways that would prove catastrophic years later. Her mother's addiction worsened when Christa was in middle school. There were stretches of weeks where Christa essentially raised herself. She fed herself when food was available. She got herself to school when she chose to go. She developed survival instincts that served her in some ways but damaged her emotionally in others. By the time she reached adolescence, the cracks were visible to everyone around her. She struggled to form healthy friendships. When she did connect with peers, the relationships often ended in conflict. She interpreted minor disagreements as betrayals. Her temper flared unpredictably. Teachers noted her disruptive behavior. Counselors documented her emotional volatility. But no one intervened in a meaningful way. She started drinking at a very early age. She skipped school regularly. She gravitated toward older kids who were similarly troubled, finding in them a sense of belonging she couldn't find at home or in the classroom. At some point, she had effectively withdrawn from the education system altogether. When she enrolled in the Knoxville Job Corps program in 1994, she arrived with hope. This would be her fresh start. A place where she could learn a trade, build a life, escape the chaos of her childhood. She was charismatic when she wanted to be. She made friends easily. Other students found her funny, bold, unafraid to speak her mind. She had stories about her rough childhood that made her seem worldly and tough. She commanded attention in group settings. Despite entering Job Corps with the hope of finding structure and direction, Christa Pike still carried the same deep emotional void that had followed her throughout childhood. She longed for acceptance, for a sense of belonging she had rarely experienced growing up. And then she met Tadarrell Shipp. Tadarrell Shipp was 17 when he arrived at Job Corps in late 1994. He had dropped out of school after 9th grade. He was raised primarily by his mother, who made genuine efforts to keep him on a positive trajectory, but struggled against influences stronger than her ability to counter them. Tadarrell was quiet, aloof, and carried himself with a kind of detached confidence that other students found intimidating. He didn't seek out friendships. He didn't participate enthusiastically in training programs. Staff members noticed he was difficult to discipline. He dismissed authority. When confronted about rule violations, he would stare silently at staff members until they gave up. But he had a way of influencing certain students, particularly those who were looking for someone to follow. He projected strength, control, and a kind of dark mystique that appealed to teenagers who felt powerless. He talked about violence casually. Christa was immediately drawn to him. He represented everything she had been looking for. Someone strong, someone who seemed untouchable, someone who made her feel protected. After he had approached her, their relationship developed quickly. Within weeks, they were inseparable. They ate meals together, attended classes together, spent most evening in each other's company. Christa's friends noticed the change in her. She became more possessive, more volatile. Everything revolved around Tadarrell. If he paid attention to another girl, Christa would spiral into jealous rage. If he criticized her, she would collapse into despair. He had become the center of her universe. Tadarrell, for his part, seemed to enjoy the control. He had found someone who would do anything for him, and he exploited that dynamic fully. By late 1994, their relationship had become toxic in ways that were visible to everyone around them. Christa had started making threats toward other female students she perceived as threats. She cornered girls in the bathroom and warned them to stay away from Tadarrell. She spread vicious rumors about anyone who spoke to him. And Tadarrell did nothing to discourage this behavior. In fact, he seemed to find it amusing. And in the closed environment of Job Corps, where staff were stretched thin and intervention was rare, no one stepped in to separate them. And then Colleen Slemmer arrived. Colleen Ann Slemmer was born on March 20th, 1975, in Jacksonville, Florida. She struggled academically and decided to move to Tennessee to attend the Job Corps program in Knoxville, where she studied computer technology. Her decision to join Job Corps reflected her ambition. She wanted practical skills and a path to independence. Colleen was earnest and hardworking, committed to building a better future through vocational training. Colleen was soft-spoken and conflict-averse. She made friends easily, but she avoided drama. She had seen enough dysfunction in the lives of friends back home to know she wanted no part of it. She kept her head down in class. She completed her assignments. She called her mother regularly to update her on her progress. She was kind to everyone, including people who others avoided. She would sit with lonely students in the dining hall. She never gossiped. She never participated in the constant social warfare that defined dorm life. She was, by every account, a genuinely good person. And that kindness extended to everyone she met, including Tadarrell Shipp. That kindness would cost her everything. The conflict began in late December 1994. Christa had briefly left the Job Corps campus to visit family in Meyer, West Virginia over the break. During her absence, Tadarrell was making moves to Colleen. He and Colleen had several conversations. They were casual, harmless exchanges. They had talked briefly about their programs, about their plans after Job Corps, about nothing of consequence. But when Christa returned and heard about these interactions, she interpreted them as a threat. Her roommates described her becoming obsessed with the idea that Colleen was trying to steal Tadarrell. Other students began spreading rumors. The Job Corps campus was a gossip mill, and any interaction between students became exaggerated through multiple retellings. Some said Colleen was interested in Tadarrell. Others claimed Tadarrell had been flirting with her. Most of it were not true. But the truth didn't matter. Christa believed she was being betrayed. And in her mind, betrayal required punishment. She began harassing Colleen openly. She would walk past Colleen in the hallway and mutter threats under her breath. She would stare at her during meals. Colleen had tried explaining that there was nothing going on between herself and Tadarrell, but Christa wasn't interested in explanations. She wanted submission. She wanted Colleen to acknowledge that Tadarrell belonged to her, and that any interaction with him was a violation of that ownership. Colleen tried to avoid her. She changed her routines. She ate meals at different times. She stayed in her dorm room whenever possible. She told staff members she felt unsafe. She described the threats Christa had made. She also called her mother. Mrs. Slemmer later testified that Colleen had called her several times in early January, describing the escalating tension. She told her mother she was scared. She said there was a girl who was threatening to hurt her. Her mother advised her to just hold on till she finishes her course. By early January 1995, multiple students had heard Christa say she was going to hurt Colleen. One classmate later testified that Christa had talked explicitly about killing her. She had described how she would lure Colleen away from campus, how she would make sure no one saw them leave, how she would make Colleen suffer. The signs were everywhere. Students knew something was going to happen. Some were scared enough to distance themselves from Christa entirely. Others were drawn to the drama, curious to see if she would actually follow through. January 11th, 1995, the night before the murder. Christa spent hours with Tadarrell and another student, Shadala Peterson. Peterson was 18, a follower who clung to Christa out of a mix of fear and fascination. She had arrived at Job Corps with her own history of troubled behavior. She saw Christa as someone powerful, someone who commanded respect through intimidation. Something was being planned. The energy between the three of them was electric, charged with anticipation. Tadarrell seemed calm, almost detached. Shadala seemed nervous but excited, and Christa seemed more focused than anyone had seen her in weeks. The next morning, January 12th, was cold. Knoxville winters are unpredictable, swinging between mild days and bitter cold. That morning was bitter. Frost covered the grass. The sky was gray and heavy. Christa found Shadala right after breakfast. They reviewed the plan. Christa would approach Colleen. She would be friendly, disarming. She would convince Colleen to go for a walk, to talk things out, to make peace. Shadala's role was to come along, and Tadarrell would follow at a distance. Around mid-morning, Christa approached Colleen. When she saw Christa, she immediately tensed. She had been avoiding her for days, but Christa's demeanor was different. She was smiling. She seemed calm. She told Colleen they needed to talk, to clear the air, to end the tension between them. She said she knew there had been misunderstandings. She said she wanted to start fresh. Colleen hesitated. Every instinct told her to walk away. But she also wanted peace. She was exhausted from weeks of harassment and fear. She believed that if she could just explain, if she could make Christa understand that nothing had happened with Tadarrell, the conflict would end. She agreed to go for a walk. Shadala appeared from around the corner, as if by coincidence. Christa introduced her casually. Colleen felt uncomfortable with the arrangement, but she didn't know how to refuse without causing another confrontation. The three of them left the Job Corps campus together. They walked toward a secluded area near the University of Tennessee agricultural campus. It was cold that day, the kind of January cold that makes the ground hard and the air sharp. Colleen walked between them, still believing this was a conversation, still hoping for resolution. Tadarrell followed several yards behind. He had been waiting near the edge of campus. None of them spoke to him directly, but they all knew he was there. They walked for about 10 minutes, moving away from the populated areas of campus. The agricultural campus was largely unused in winter. There were no classes in session, no workers in the fields, no reason for anyone to be there. They entered a wooded area. The trees closed in around them. The sounds of the campus faded. The only noise was their footsteps crunching on frozen ground and the occasional call of a winter bird. And then Christa's demeanor changed. The attack began with accusations. Christa stopped walking. She turned to face Colleen. Her expression had transformed from friendly to furious in seconds. She began shouting, demanding answers about Tadarl. She called Colleen names. She accused her of trying to steal him, of lying, of disrespecting her. Christa didn't want explanations. She wanted vengeance. She had spent weeks building up this confrontation in her mind. She had convinced herself that Colleen was the enemy, the threat, the person who needed to be eliminated. Christa struck her. The first blow was with her fist, hitting Colleen in the face. The violence escalated quickly. What started as a confrontation became a prolonged assault. Christa had brought a box cutter with her. She pulled it from her pocket and began slashing at Colleen's body. The cuts were shallow at first, designed to cause pain rather than fatal injury. Christa wanted Colleen to suffer. She also picked up a piece of asphalt from the ground, a chunk about the size of her fist. She used it to strike Colleen's head repeatedly. Each blow made a sickening sound. Colleen's scalp split open. Blood poured from the wounds. The few times Colleen tried to escape, Tadarl stopped her and pinned her down. Colleen fought back as hard as she could. She managed to break free from Tadarl's grip at one point and tried to run, but he was onto her again. The attack lasted more than 30 minutes. Christa used the box cutter and the piece of asphalt. She inflicted wounds that were calculated to cause maximum suffering. She cut Colleen's clothing away. She carved into her skin. She struck her head over and over. This was not a crime of sudden rage. It was deliberate. It was personal. And it was prolonged. Colleen begged for her life. She pleaded with Christa to stop. She cried. She promised she would never speak to Tadarl again. She said she was sorry, even though she had done nothing wrong. She begged for mercy that would never come. Tadarl participated actively. He held Colleen down when she tried to escape. He encouraged Christa to continue. He laughed at Colleen's pleas. Shadala watched, paralyzed by fear or complicity or both. She later claimed she had been too scared to intervene, but witnesses would testify that she had seemed more excited than frightened. As Colleen's resistance weakened, Christa's violence intensified. She stabbed her repeatedly with the box cutter. She struck her head with such force that the skull began to fracture. And then, when Colleen was barely conscious, Christa did something that would define the case. She used the box cutter to carve a pentagram into Colleen's chest. The symbol was crude but deliberate. She had been planning this. She had thought about it. She wanted to mark her victim. And then she took a piece of Colleen's skull. Using the sharp edge of the asphalt and the box cutter, she pried loose a fragment of bone from where the skull had fractured, and she put it in her pocket. Colleen Slemmer died in those woods. She was 19 years old. She had come to Knoxville to build a better life. She had been kind to everyone she met, and she died in terror and agony because a jealous teenager had decided she was a threat. The three of them left the woods. They walked back toward campus. Tadarl and Shadala were shaken, silent. The reality of what they had done was beginning to sink in. But Christa was energized. She had taken a life, and she had taken a trophy to prove it. If you're finding this story as disturbing as it is compelling, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you care about. Stories like this remind us how quickly jealousy and violence can escalate, especially when warning signs are ignored. Your support helps us continue bringing you these important real-life crime stories that shed light on the darkest corners of human behavior. Back on campus, Christa couldn't contain herself. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins. She felt powerful in a way she had never experienced. She had proven something to herself, to Tadarl, to everyone who had ever doubted her or dismissed her. She bragged to other students about what she had done. She found classmates in the common area and described the murder in graphic detail. Some students were horrified. They backed away from her, disturbed by the gleam in her eyes and the pride in her voice. Others didn't believe her. Christa had a history of exaggeration and attention-seeking behavior. They assumed she was making it up for shock value. But then she showed them the skull fragment. She pulled it from her pocket, unwrapped it, and held it up for them to see. She explained what it was, where she had taken it from, why she had kept it. The students who saw it were traumatized, but Christa just laughed. She was proud of her trophy. She wanted everyone to know what she had done. Shadala, by contrast, was falling apart. She returned to her dorm room and couldn't stop shaking. Her roommate asked what was wrong. Shadala initially said nothing, but the roommate persisted. Eventually, Shadala broke down and told her everything. The roommate was horrified. She told Shadala she needed to go to the police. Shadala refused. She was terrified of what Christa would do to her if she found out. She made her roommate promise not to tell anyone. But within hours, Colleen's absence was noticed. She had missed her afternoon training session. Her instructor marked her absent. When she didn't return to her dorm room that evening, her roommates became concerned. They reported her missing to staff. Job Corps administrators began searching for her. They checked her usual locations. They questioned her friends. No one had seen her since mid-morning. Several students mentioned that she had been with Christa Pike, but when staff asked Christa about it, she claimed they had talked briefly and then Colleen had walked off alone. By late evening, staff contacted local police. A missing person report was filed. Officers began interviewing students, and that's when the truth started to emerge. Multiple students mentioned that Christa had been bragging about hurting Colleen. One student, terrified but determined to do the right thing, told police that Christa had shown her a piece of human bone. She described it in detail. She said Christa had claimed it came from Colleen's skull. After Colleen Slemmer's disappearance on January 12, 1995, police questioned Christa Pike about her involvement. Initially, Pike denied having any part in the crime. Investigators quickly focused on Pike due to witness statements and reports from other students, indicating that she and Tatterall Shipp had lured Colleen off campus. Through questioning, Pike and Shipp eventually admitted involvement in the murder. Police recovered a piece of Colleen's skull from Pike's possession, which became key evidence. Shadala Peterson, who had accompanied Pike and Shipp, also cooperated with investigators, providing testimony about the events leading to Colleen's death. Colleen Slemmer's body was discovered on January 13, 1995. A team of officers went to the location Shadala had described. The scene was exactly as she had said. They found Colleen's body lying in a clearing. She was partially unclothed. Her face was unrecognizable from the trauma. Her skull showed multiple fractures. The medical examiner was disturbed by what he found. The level of violence, the prolonged nature of the attack, the deliberate mutilation of the body, and the missing piece of skull, carved away with obvious intent. The autopsy revealed the full extent of Colleen's injuries. She had been stabbed multiple times. Her skull had been fractured in at least 4 places. She had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she had fought desperately for her life. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, but she had suffered immensely before dying. The pentagram carved into her chest was photographed as evidence. It had been cut with enough force to leave permanent marks in her skin. The forensic team processed the scene meticulously. They collected blood samples. They documented footprints in the frozen ground. They photographed the piece of asphalt that had been used as a weapon, still covered in blood and hair. They noted the disturbances in the area that indicated a prolonged struggle. Back at the police station, investigators matched the skull fragment in Christa's possession to the missing section of Colleen's skull. It fit perfectly. There was no doubt. Christa Pike had taken a piece of her victim's body as a souvenir. The arrests happened swiftly. Christa Pike, Tatterall Shipp, and Shadala Peterson were all taken into custody. They were charged separately based on their level of involvement. Christa was charged with first-degree murder. The charge carried the possibility of the death penalty. Prosecutors made it clear from the beginning that they would seek execution. The premeditation, the brutality, the trophy-taking, all of it pointed to a level of depravity that warranted the ultimate punishment. Tatterall was charged with first-degree murder as well, but because he was 17 at the time of the crime, he could not be sentenced to death under Tennessee law. He would face life imprisonment if convicted. Shadala was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and facilitation of murder. She had not physically harmed Colleen, but she had failed to intervene during the attack. Prosecutors believed she deserved significant punishment, but they also recognized that her cooperation had been crucial in solving the case. The media coverage began immediately. Local news stations reported the murder within hours of the body's discovery. By the next day, the story had spread statewide, and within a week, national media outlets were covering the case. The details captured public attention. An 18-year-old girl, a murder motivated by jealousy, a victim tortured for more than 30 minutes, and most shocking of all, the skull fragment. News anchors struggled to describe it without sensationalizing. Newspapers ran headlines that emphasized the trophy aspect of the crime. Colleen Slemmer's family was devastated. Her collapsed when police informed her of her daughter's death. She had spoken to Colleen just days earlier. She had told her to stay away from the girl who was threatening her. She had believed the Job Corps staff would protect her daughter. Now her daughter was dead, and the image of what had been done to her would haunt the family forever. Colleen's father told reporters that his daughter had been an angel. She had never hurt anyone. She had been trying to build a better life, and she had been murdered by someone who saw her kindness as a threat. The family demanded justice. They wanted Christa Pike to face the death penalty. They wanted her to pay the ultimate price for what she had done. The legal process began in early 1995. Christa Pike was held without bond. Her defense attorneys immediately began preparing for what they knew would be a difficult case. The evidence against her was overwhelming. There were witnesses to her threats, testimonies about her bragging, physical evidence linking her to the scene, and most damning of all, the skull fragment. It was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Not just because it proved she had been at the scene, but because it revealed her mindset. She hadn't taken the bone by accident. She had carved it from Colleen's skull intentionally. She had kept it as a souvenir. It was a trophy of dominance, proof of what she had done. Defense attorneys knew they couldn't argue innocence. Christa had admitted to being present during the murder. The physical evidence was irrefutable. Instead, they prepared to argue mitigating circumstances during the sentencing phase. They would present evidence of her traumatic childhood, her mental health issues, and Tatterall's influence over her. The trial began in March 1996, more than a year after the murder. The delay had been caused by pretrial motions and psychiatric evaluations. Christa was 19 years old by the time she sat in the courtroom. She had gained weight during her time in jail. Her dark aesthetic had been replaced with standard jail-issue clothing, but her demeanor remained defiant. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial. Media representatives filled the gallery. Colleen's family sat in the front row, their grief visible to everyone. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward and methodical. They presented the crime as premeditated, brutal, and indicative of a complete lack of remorse. The lead prosecutor opened with a statement that would set the tone for the entire trial. He described Christa Pike as a jealous teenager who had planned and executed a murder with cold calculation. He told the jury they would hear testimony about weeks of threats, about a carefully orchestrated luring, about torture that lasted more than half an hour. And then he held up the skull fragment, sealed in an evidence bag. He told the jury that this piece of bone would tell them everything they needed to know about who Christa Pike was and what she had done. The first witnesses were Job Corps students, who testified about the escalating conflict between Christa and Colleen. They described the threats Christa had made in the weeks leading up to the murder. One student testified that Christa had said she wanted to shut Colleen up permanently. Another described hearing Christa discuss how she would get Colleen alone. Job Corps staff members testified about the complaints they had received. A resident advisor admitted that she had documented multiple reports from Colleen about feeling threatened. The prosecution used these testimonies to establish that Christa had been planning violence and that multiple people had been aware of the danger. They argued that the murder could have been prevented if proper intervention had occurred, but they also emphasized that Christa's intent had been clear long before the fatal day. Then came the students who had witnessed Christa's behavior after the murder. Their testimonies were devastating. A young woman described how Christa had approached her in the evening of January 12th and bragged about killing Colleen. She said Christa had been smiling, almost giddy. She had described the murder in graphic detail, including how long it had taken Colleen to die. Another student testified about seeing the skull fragment. She described how Christa had pulled it from her pocket, unwrapped it, and shown it to a group of students. Shadala Peterson testified as part of a plea agreement. She had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony was critical because she was the only witness to the actual murder besides Christa and Tatterall. Shadala described the planning that had occurred the night before. She testified that Christa had talked about hurting Colleen and that Tatterall had encouraged her. She described how they had lured Colleen from campus, how Christa had suddenly turned violent, how Tatterall had helped restrain the victim. She testified about the duration of the attack. She said it had felt like hours, though it was probably closer to 40 minutes. She described hearing Colleen beg for her life. She described watching Christa carve the pentagram into Colleen's chest, and she described seeing Christa take the piece of skull. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys tried to paint Shadala as an equally culpable participant who was escaping justice through her cooperation. But her testimony was consistent with physical evidence and with statements from other witnesses. The jury appeared to believe her. Law enforcement officers testified about the investigation. The detective who had interviewed Christa described her changing stories and eventual admission. He testified that she had shown no remorse during questioning. He said she had been more concerned about whether she would be allowed to see Tatterall than about the fact that she had killed someone. The medical examiner provided detailed testimony about Colleen's injuries. He walked the jury through the autopsy findings, describing each wound, each fracture, each indication of suffering. He testified that Colleen had likely remained conscious for most of the attack, that she would have been aware of what was happening to her, that she would have experienced tremendous pain and terror. He also testified about the missing skull fragment. He said the piece had been removed deliberately, with significant force and precision. It wasn't something that had broken off during the attack. It had been carved out intentionally. The prosecution presented the skull fragment as physical evidence. The jury was allowed to examine it. Several jurors looked uncomfortable as they passed the evidence bag between them. One woman appeared to be crying. The impact of seeing the actual trophy that Christa had kept was profound. The defense called witnesses who testified about Christa's difficult childhood. A social worker who had worked with her family in West Virginia described the neglect and instability she had experienced. Teachers testified about her struggles in school and her emotional volatility. Several mental health experts testified on Christa's behalf. They presented evidence of attachment disorders, personality disturbances, and emotional instability. They argued that her dependence on Tatterall's ship was pathological and that she had been manipulated by him. One psychologist testified that Christa suffered from borderline personality disorder and that her fear of abandonment had been the driving force behind the murder. He argued that she had genuinely believed Tatterall would leave her for Colleen and that this belief had been intolerable to her. The defense also called witnesses who testified about Tatterall's influence over Christa. Fellow students described how he had controlled her, how he had encouraged her jealousy, how he had seemed to enjoy watching her suffer. The defense argued that while Christa had committed the murder, Tatterall had been the puppet master. But the prosecution countered effectively. They pointed out that regardless of Tatterall's influence, Christa had made the choice to kill. She had planned it, she had executed it, and most importantly, she had taken a trophy from her victim's body. That action, they argued, revealed something beyond manipulation. It revealed someone who took pride in what she had done. The closing arguments were powerful on both sides. The prosecution emphasized premeditation, brutality, and the trophy. They argued that Christa Pike represented a level of danger that warranted the death penalty. They showed photos of Colleen before the murder, a smiling teenager with her whole life ahead of her. Then they showed photos from the crime scene. The contrast was devastating. The defense argued that Christa was a damaged young woman who had been failed by every system meant to protect her. They emphasized her age at the time of the crime, her mental health issues, and the influence Tatterall had exerted over her. They argued that while she deserved punishment, execution was too extreme for someone who had been 18 years old and acting under psychological duress. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Christa Pike was convicted of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions. Colleen's family wept with relief. Christa showed no visible response. The sentencing phase began immediately. This was where the jury would decide whether Christa would receive life imprisonment or death. Both sides presented additional evidence and testimony. The prosecution focused on aggravating factors. They emphasized the heinous nature of the crime, the suffering Colleen had endured, and the trophy-taking. They argued that Christa represented an ongoing danger to society, and that execution was the only appropriate sentence. The defense presented mitigating factors. They called additional witnesses who testified about Christa's troubled childhood. They presented evidence of abuse and neglect. They argued that her youth at the time of the crime should be considered. They pleaded with the jury to show mercy. But the skull fragment overshadowed everything else. The prosecution returned to it repeatedly. They reminded the jury that Christa had taken this piece of bone as a souvenir, that she had carried it proudly, that she had shown it to people as proof of her power. They argued that this action alone revealed someone who lacked any capacity for remorse or rehabilitation. The jury in Christa Pike's trial sentenced her to death for the murder of Colleen Slemmer. At the time of her sentencing in March 1996, Pike was 20 years old, making her the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States in modern history. Tadarrell Shipp's trial followed several months later. Because he had been 17 at the time of the murder, he could not be sentenced to death under Tennessee law. He was convicted of first-degree murder and received life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Shadala Peterson, who had cooperated with prosecutors, accepted a plea deal. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison for facilitation of murder. She would be released in 2001. Christa Pike was transferred to the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville. Death row for women was located in a separate unit from the general population. The conditions were harsh. She was confined to her cell for 23 hours a day. She was allowed 1 hour of recreation in a small outdoor cage. She had limited contact with other inmates. The adjustment to death row was difficult for everyone, but Christa struggled more than most. She clashed with guards. She accumulated disciplinary infractions. She seemed unable or unwilling to accept the reality of her situation. In 2001, Christa committed another violent act that would become pivotal in her appeals process. She attempted to murder a fellow inmate, Patricia Jones. The attack was premeditated and brutal. Christa had fashioned a weapon from a shoestring and had planned to strangle Jones in the prison yard. The motivation for the attack was unclear. Regardless of the reason, she executed the attack with the same cold calculation she had shown in Colleen's murder. Christa was charged with attempted first-degree murder. She was convicted and received an additional 25-year sentence to be served consecutively to her death sentence. The 2001 attack had significant implications for her appeals. Defense attorneys who had been arguing that she could be rehabilitated now had to contend with evidence that she had committed another serious violent crime while already on death row. It undermined every argument they had made about her capacity for change. Appeals courts would later cite the 2001 attack repeatedly as evidence that Christa Pike remained a danger to society. It became one of the primary reasons subsequent appeals were denied. For nearly 3 decades, Christa Pike's case has moved through the appeals process. The legal system provides multiple layers of review for death penalty cases, and Christa's attorneys have pursued every available avenue. Her first appeal to the Tennessee Supreme Court focused on claims of ineffective counsel. Her attorneys argued that her trial lawyers had not adequately investigated her mental health history and had failed to present sufficient mitigating evidence during sentencing. The Tennessee Supreme Court reviewed the case and denied the appeal in 2001. They found that Christa had received adequate representation and that the jury's decision was supported by the evidence. Subsequent state appeals raised similar issues. Her attorneys argued that the trial court had made errors in jury selection, in admitting certain evidence, and in jury instructions. Each appeal was reviewed and denied. The Tennessee courts consistently upheld the conviction and sentence. Christa's attorneys then moved to federal court, filing a habeas corpus petition. Federal habeas review allows death row inmates to challenge their convictions in federal court based on constitutional violations. The process is lengthy and involves multiple stages of review. In federal court, Christa's attorneys raised new claims. They argued that Her Eighth Amendment rights had been violated because she had been sentenced to death for a crime committed when she was 18. They cited evolving standards of decency in brain development research, suggesting that young adults lack the same level of judgment as older adults. They also argued that the jury had not been properly instructed on mitigating factors. They claimed that the trial court's instructions had made it difficult for jurors to give adequate weight to Christa's troubled childhood and mental health issues. Federal courts reviewed these claims carefully, but ultimately they were denied. The courts found that Christa had been 18 at the time of the crime, which was legally an adult. While brain development research was compelling, it did not change the legal standard. The Supreme Court had ruled that executing individuals who were minors at the time of their crimes was unconstitutional, but Christa had been 18, placing her outside that protection. Her attorneys also argued juror misconduct, claiming that one juror had conducted independent research on the case during deliberations. This claim went through extensive review, including evidentiary hearings. But the courts ultimately found insufficient evidence to support it. Throughout the appeals process, the skull fragment remained a focal point. Prosecutors repeatedly emphasized that this physical evidence demonstrated premeditation and a complete lack of remorse. They argued that the trophy-taking distinguished this case from others and justified the death penalty. Defense attorneys struggled to counter this argument effectively. They could provide context about Christa's psychological state, but they couldn't explain away the fact that she had carved a piece of bone from her victim and kept it as a souvenir. By 2011, Christa had exhausted most of her state and federal appeals. Her case returned to Tennessee courts for execution scheduling. The Tennessee Attorney General's office filed motions requesting that an execution date be set. But the process continued to drag on. Additional legal challenges emerged. Defense attorneys filed motions challenging Tennessee's execution protocol. They argued that the state's method of execution constituted cruel and unusual punishment. These challenges delayed execution scheduling for several years. Tennessee has had ongoing legal and procedural reviews related to executions, which affected Christa Pike's case over the years. As of 2025, Christa Pike remains on death row in Tennessee. She is 49 years old and has spent the majority of her life in prison. Her execution has been scheduled for September 30th, 2026. The debate surrounding Christa Pike's case extends beyond her individual guilt or innocence. Everyone agrees she committed the murder. The question is whether executing her serves justice, or whether her age at the time of the crime and her psychological state warrant a different sentence. Opponents of her execution argue that she was essentially a teenager when she killed Colleen. They point to research showing that brain development continues into the mid-20s and that judgment, impulse control, and decision-making are not fully developed at 18. They argue that while her crime was horrific, she deserves the possibility of rehabilitation rather than execution. They also point to her traumatic childhood and mental health issues. They argue that she was failed by every system that should have protected and helped her, from her family to the educational system to Job Corps. They believe that executing someone who never received adequate mental health treatment is unjust. Supporters of the death penalty in her case argue that the brutality of the crime justifies execution regardless of her age. They emphasize that she planned the murder, that she tortured her victim for more than 30 minutes, and that she took a trophy. They argue these actions demonstrate a level of depravity that transcends any mitigating factors. They also point to the 2001 attempted murder as evidence that Christa remains dangerous and lacks capacity for rehabilitation. They argue that she has shown consistently throughout her incarceration that she is violent, remorseless, and incapable of change. Colleen's family has remained consistent in their support for Christa's execution. They have attended every hearing and have made victim impact statements emphasizing the loss they suffered. Colleen Slemmer's mother has said publicly that she believes Christa should be executed because justice demands it. She has described the decades of pain her family has endured and has argued that Christa has never shown genuine remorse for what she did. The legal community is divided. Some attorneys and judges believe the death penalty should be reserved for the most extreme cases, and that Christa's youth at the time of the crime places her outside that category. Others believe her case represents exactly the kind of premeditated, brutal murder that warrants capital punishment. What makes the Christa Pike case particularly compelling from a legal and psychological perspective is the trophy element. Trophy taking by killers is well documented in criminal psychology, but it's relatively rare among female offenders and extremely rare among teenage offenders. Psychologists who have studied the case point to several factors that may explain why Christa took the skull fragment. First, her profound sense of powerlessness throughout her childhood created a need to assert dominance. Taking a piece of her victim's body was the ultimate expression of control. Second, her lack of secure attachments throughout her life meant she had never developed normal empathy. She couldn't connect Colleen's suffering to any emotional response in herself. She saw Colleen as an object, a threat to be eliminated rather than a person with her own life and feelings. The trophy also reveals something about Christa's understanding of the crime. She knew she had done something significant. She wanted proof of it. She wanted to be able to show people what she was capable of. The skull fragment was her way of saying, "I did this, and I'm powerful because of it." This psychological profile suggests someone with severe personality disturbances and a complete lack of remorse. It supports the prosecution's argument that she represents an ongoing danger. But it also raises questions about culpability. If someone is so psychologically damaged that they can commit this kind of act, are they truly responsible in the same way as someone without these disturbances? These are the questions that continue to surround Christa Pike's case. They're questions without easy answers. Today, nearly 30 years after Colleen Slemmer's murder, the case continues to resonate in Tennessee and beyond. It's taught in criminal justice courses as an example of extreme teenage violence. It's cited in legal scholarship about juvenile sentencing and the death penalty. And it's remembered by everyone who knew Colleen as a tragic loss of a young woman who deserved so much better. Colleen's family has worked to keep her memory alive in positive ways. Colleen's mother has said in interviews that she thinks about her daughter every day. She keeps photos of Colleen throughout her home. She celebrates what would have been her birthdays. She mourns the life Colleen could have lived, the family she might have had, the contributions she could have made to the world. The Knoxville Job Corps program made changes after Colleen's murder. They increased staff supervision. They implemented better threat assessment protocols. They improved their response procedures for student conflicts. But advocates argue that Job Corps programs nationwide still struggle with inadequate resources and supervision. Tattereel Shipp remains incarcerated at a maximum security facility in Tennessee. He became eligible for parole consideration, but was denied. He will have additional parole hearings in the future, but given the nature of his crime, he is unlikely to be released. Shadala Peterson was released from prison in 2001 after serving her 6-year sentence. Christa Pike continues to file appeals, but legal experts believe her options are nearly exhausted. Tennessee has resumed executions after a period of review, and the state appears determined to carry out her sentence. When that happens, it will mark the end of one of the longest-running death penalty cases in Tennessee history. The Christa Pike case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about youth violence, mental health, and the criminal justice system. It reminds us that warning signs are often visible long before tragedies occur. Multiple people knew Christa was threatening Colleen. Multiple people reported concerns, but the systems in place failed to act quickly enough. It also raises questions about how we treat troubled youth. Christa Pike was failed repeatedly throughout her childhood. She never received consistent mental health care. She never learned healthy coping mechanisms. She never developed secure attachments. By the time she arrived at Job Corps, she was already severely damaged. Should society have intervened earlier? Could anything have prevented what happened? These questions don't excuse her actions, but they do highlight systemic failures that continue to affect vulnerable young people today. The trophy element of the case remains its most disturbing aspect. Taking that skull fragment wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. It was calculated. It was intentional. It revealed something dark and fundamental about who Christa Pike was in that moment. Whether she remains that person today is something only those who interact with her regularly can assess. But the 2001 attempted murder suggests that her capacity for violence persists even after decades of incarceration. As you consider this case, remember Colleen Slemmer. Remember that she was a real person with dreams and plans. She wanted to build a stable, independent life. She was kind to everyone she met, including the person who would kill her. Her murder was preventable. The systems that were supposed to protect her failed, and her family has lived with that knowledge for 3 decades. Justice for Colleen has moved slowly through the courts. Whether Christa Pike's eventual execution will bring closure to the Slemmer family remains to be seen. Some victims' families report that executions don't provide the peace they expected. Others say it helps to know the perpetrator has faced the ultimate consequence. What we know for certain is that on January 12, 1995, a jealous teenager made a choice that destroyed multiple lives. Colleen lost everything. Christa lost her freedom and possibly her life. 2 families were devastated, and everyone touched by this case carries the weight of it still. The story of Christa Pike is not just about one crime or one killer. It's about what happens when mental health issues go untreated, when warning signs are ignored, and when vulnerable young people fall through every crack in the system. It's about jealousy taken to its darkest extreme, about obsession that turns lethal, about the terrible consequences of feeling powerless and seeking power through violence. And it's about a piece of bone, carefully carved from a victim's skull and carried as proof of dominance. That fragment tells us everything we need to know about the mind of someone who could commit such an act. It reveals a complete detachment from empathy, a transformation of a human being into an object, a trophy to commemorate power. What story do you want us to cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and let us know what aspects of true crime you find most compelling. If this story impacted you, hit that subscribe button and share it with others. These cases matter because they teach us about the consequences of ignored warnings and the fragility of the choices we make every day. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you in-depth coverage of the cases that shaped criminal justice history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.